The stars above Kereth, 7, were quiet that morning. The planet sat in the outer rim of a small system, far from the busy trade lanes and political centers of the galaxy. It was a farming world. Green fields stretched across its continents. Rivers ran cold and clean between low hills. The air smelled of soil and rain. Around 80,000 humans lived there, mostly farmers, engineers, and their families. They grew food. They raised animals. They built roads and schools and small churches with painted windows. It was the kind of world that nobody paid much attention to. That was exactly why the Vorkai chose it. Fleet Commander Shal Kathan stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominant Will, and watched Kereth, 7, grow larger on his main screen. He had his hands folded behind his back. His posture was calm and straight, the way it always was before a conquest. He had done this 14 times before. 14 planets. 14 species that had looked up at his ships, and then looked down and accepted the truth of their situation. He expected this to be the 15th. The Vorkai were not a cruel people, by their own measure. They did not destroy worlds. They took them. They came in with overwhelming force. They broke any resistance before it could form. They installed their administration, and they moved on. It was clean. It was efficient. It was simply how the galaxy worked, as far as they were concerned. Strength ruled. Weakness submitted. That was the natural order. And humans were weak. Shal Kathan had read the reports carefully. Humanity was a young species, only a few centuries into space travel. They had no major alliances, no significant military treaties. Their fleet was small, mostly transport ships and light patrol craft. They had colonies scattered across a dozen systems, but those colonies were thin and poorly defended. They were expanding fast, the way young species always did, full of energy and noise, building and spreading before they truly understood how dangerous the galaxy was. They were about to learn. Behind the Dominant Will, 200 Vorkai warships moved in tight formation. The fleet filled the space around Kereth, 7's outer orbit like a wall of steel. Their hulls were dark gray, angular, built for intimidation as much as combat. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a city. Together, they could crack the surface of a small moon. It was, by any measure, far more force than was needed for a single farming colony. Shal Kathan preferred it that way. Overwhelming force meant no complications. His science officer, a quiet young Vorkai named Pel-Sev, was moving between his instruments, running standard pre-engagement scans. Atmospheric density, population distribution, energy output, infrastructure mapping, all routine, all expected. Shal Kathan barely listened as Pel-Sev murmured his findings. Then the human transmission arrived. It came in on all open channels, calm and clear, in the standard galactic trade language. The voice belonged to a woman. She spoke without shouting, without panic, without any of the desperate pleading that Shal Kathan had heard from frightened colonial administrators on other worlds. Attention, unidentified fleet. This is Director Yeva Marchetti of the Karath, 7 Colonial Administration. You have entered sovereign human space without authorization. You are advised to stop your approach and identify your intentions. Please be aware that a colonial distress and response beacon has been activated. We ask that you withdraw. This is our only warning. The bridge was quiet for a moment after the message ended. Then, one of the senior officers made a low sound that was almost a laugh. Another shook his head slowly. Shal Kathan allowed himself a small smile. One warning. From a farming colony. With no warships in sight. The woman had nerve. He would give her that. But nerve without strength was just noise. He told his communications officer to send a standard response, the Vorkai, Formal Declaration of Territorial Claim, the document they sent to every species they were about to subjugate. It was polite, in its way. It explained the situation clearly. It gave the population a choice between cooperation and suffering. He did not expect a reply. What he did not tell anyone on the bridge was that the transmission had bothered him slightly. Not the words themselves. The tone. Director Marchetti had not sounded afraid. She had sounded like someone who had already made a decision, and was simply informing others of it. That was not the voice of a woman watching 200 warships appear above her world. That was the voice of someone who believed she held a position of strength. Shalkathan told himself she was bluffing. All politicians bluffed. He turned his attention back to the planet. He was already thinking about the landing zones, the population centers, the quickest way to establish ground control. He was thinking about the logistics report he would file when this was done, and the small ceremony his crew would hold to mark the 15th conquest. He was already moving past this. Behind him, Pelsev's voice broke the quiet. "Commander," the science officer said. There was something odd in his voice. Not alarm. Not quite. Something closer to uncertainty, which was not an emotion Pelsev usually expressed. "I am reading an anomalous signature." "Define anomalous," Shalkathan said, without turning around. "Heat output, radiation pattern consistent with a very large drive system." A pause. The sound of instruments being checked again, rechecked. "It is coming from the dark side of the colony's moon." Shalkathan turned then. "A ship?" "I believe so, Commander. But the scale of the reading is—" Pelsev stopped, looked at his screen, looked again. "It is larger than expected. I may be reading an error in the instrument." "Check the instrument," Shalkathan said. "I have, sir, 3 times. Another officer spoke up from his station, pulling data to his own screen. "I am also reading it, Commander. The signature is real. It appears to be coming from deep within the moon's shadow, possibly anchored on the far surface, or positioned just behind the lunar body." "What class of vessel could produce that output?" Shalkathan asked. The officers exchanged a look. Nobody answered right away. That itself was unusual. "We have no classification on file that matches these readings," Pelsev said finally. His voice was very careful now. Measured. Like a man choosing his words, so that they would not sound like the words he actually wanted to say. "Whatever it is, Commander, it is very large." Shalkathan looked at the moon on his screen. Dark. Quiet. Sitting there the way moons always sit. Heavy and still. The shadow on its far side was just shadow. Just absence of light. Nothing to be afraid of. He thought again about Director Marchetti. Her calm voice. Her one warning. A colonial distress and response beacon has been activated. Response. Not distress. Response. He pushed the thought away. He had 200 warships. He had never met a force in 14 campaigns that could change what that meant. Whatever was behind that moon, it was one vessel. It did not matter how large it was. "Keep monitoring it," he told Pelsev. "If it moves, inform me immediately." He turned back to the planet. He went back to his logistics planning. On the screen, at the very edge of the lunar shadow, something enormous began, very slowly, to move. The first thing that moved was the shadow. Not the ship itself, not yet. Just the shadow it cast. The moon's dark side had been a flat, unbroken sheet of black on every Vorkai screen. Then, slowly, that black began to change shape. Something was blocking the stars behind it. A silhouette, an outline, massive and dark and utterly silent. It slid along the edge of the lunar body like something that had been sleeping against the stone and had now decided, in its own time, to wake up. Pelsev made a sound. Not words, just a short, sharp sound, like a man who had breathed in and then forgotten to breathe out. The bridge of the dominant will had been filled with the low noise of routine operations, the hum of instruments, the quiet voices of officers running standard checks, the distant pulse of the ship's drives. All of it stopped. One by one, without being told to, without any order from Shalkathan, the officers at their stations turned to look at the main screen. The silhouette kept growing. It did not appear all at once. That was the first thing that truly registered in Shalkathan's mind as the shape emerged from the moon's shadow. A normal warship appeared all at once. You saw the bow, then the hull, then the stern. It took seconds. This was not taking seconds. The front of the vessel cleared the shadow, and then kept clearing it, and kept clearing it. And the bow alone was already larger than the largest ship in the Vorkai fleet. And then more of it appeared. The hull was dark. Not painted dark, worn dark. the color of metal that had been through heat and pressure so many times that the surface had changed its nature entirely. There were scars on it, long ones, deep gouges that ran across entire sections of the hull, like claw marks from something even bigger. The plating was layered, thick, stacked on top of itself like the scales of an ancient creature, each layer presumably there because something, at some point, had gotten through the one before it. The ship had been hurt before, many times, and it had survived all of it. The main battery turrets came into view next, gun emplacements the size of city blocks, barrels that could have housed entire buildings. They sat in rows along the upper hull, evenly spaced, angled slightly upward, like the fingers of a hand that had not yet decided to close into a fist. Shalkathan counted them without meaning to. He stopped counting at 30, and the ship was still coming. Still coming. The drive section finally cleared the shadow last, and when it did, every pilot in the Vorkai fleet received a proximity alert, because the thermal output of those drives, even at low idle, was enough to register as a star on their heat sensors. The plumes were the color of white fire. They were not burning hard. The ship was barely moving, and even at barely moving, it covered the distance of a small continent between one breath and the next. On the main screen, a small label resolved in the center of the vessel's hull. Human letters, large enough to be read from space. Pelsev translated it aloud, in a voice that had gone completely flat and empty of expression. UWSC Ares Unbound. Nobody spoke. Shalkathan stood very still. He was looking at the ship the way a person looks at something their mind is not entirely willing to accept. He was a veteran. He had seen big ships. He had commanded big ships. He understood scale and firepower and the geometry of battle. His mind was trying to apply all of that experience to what was on the screen in front of him, and finding that the numbers did not fit. The categories did not fit. The concepts he had used for 14 successful campaigns were bending under the weight of what he was looking at. The Ares Unbound was not a warship in any sense the word usually carried. Warships were built for war. This had been built as war itself, shaped into a vessel, given a name, and then pointed at things that needed to stop existing. It was a mobile fortress. No, a mobile city, but a city whose every building was a weapons system, whose every road was a targeting corridor, whose every wall was armor so thick that the science officer's scans could not determine where it ended. It moved through space the way a mountain would move, if mountains could decide to do so not with speed, but with the kind of slow, inevitable weight that made speed irrelevant. Several things happened on the bridge at once. A junior officer stood up from his station. He did not request permission. He simply stood up, and then stood there, not doing anything, just standing, because his body had decided that sitting down was not appropriate, given what was on the screen. Another officer's hands had stopped moving over his controls. He was staring. His jaw was open. He was not a young officer. He had been in the fleet for 30 years. He had fought in 2 wars. At the back of the bridge, someone made a very quiet noise that Shalkathan chose not to identify. He forced himself to speak. It was important to speak. Silence was how fear spread on a bridge. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. "Weapons range?" he asked. The officer responsible for tactical assessment looked at his screen. Looked at it for a long moment. "Commander, at current scale estimates, the vessel's weapon systems likely exceed any range projection our models support. We would need to revise our shields. We cannot scan through the outer hull to assess internal systems. The plating is..." The officer paused. "Our active sensors are reflecting back, sir. We are not penetrating it." Shalkathan looked at the Ares Unbound. It had finished clearing the moon's shadow now. All of it was visible. All of it was real. It sat in space between his fleet and the planet below. Not aggressive, not yet moving toward them. Just present. The way a wall is present. The way a cliff face is present when you realize you have been walking toward it in the dark. The hull of the massive vessel had scars, yes. Deep ones, old ones. But there were also markings. Symbols painted in faded white along one section of the bow. Pelsev zoomed in. They were tallies. Lines. Groups of lines. Marks made to count something. There were hundreds of them. Before anyone could speak again, the communications board lit up across every channel, across the entire Vorkai fleet simultaneously. The voice that came through was unhurried. Calm. Slightly rough, like a person who spent more time giving orders than making conversation. Fleet Commander. This is Admiral Dione Ose of the UWSC Ares Unbound, Colonial Defense Command. You have entered human sovereign space without authorization and have begun an approach toward the civilian colony of Karath, 7. You were given one warning by Director Marchetti. I am giving you a second, as a courtesy only. You have 60 seconds to acknowledge the colony's demand and begin withdrawal. After 60 seconds, I will be authorized to respond under Colonial Defense Directive 1. I recommend you use the time well. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, the clock is running. Shalkathan looked at the screen, at the ship, at the tallies on its hull, at the gun batteries that could probably reach him already and were not yet pointed at him only because the humans had decided to give him a clock to watch first. He was Fleet Commander Shalkathan. He had 14 conquests to his name. He had never once, in his entire career, felt what he was feeling right now. He turned to his communications officer and began to speak. Then he stopped. He did not know what to say. Shalkathan found his voice after several seconds. He ordered the fleet to hold position. He ordered weapons armed. He ordered shields raised across all 200 ships, because doing anything was better than standing still with nothing but that enormous shadow on the screen and 60 seconds ticking down in his head. The orders came out of him automatically, the way old habits do when the mind is busy with other things. The other thing his mind was busy with was the tallies on the hull of the Ares Unbound. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. He had not been able to count them all before Pelsev had pulled the view back. But he had seen enough. Each mark, he understood, represented something. Ships destroyed. Battles won. Planets defended. Maybe something worse than any of those. They were the record of a weapon that had been used many times before, kept not as decoration, but as memory. As statement. I have done this before. Many times. And I am still here. From the back of the bridge, Sub-Commander Veth moved forward quietly. Veth was younger than most of the senior officers. He was careful, methodical, and he had a habit of reading intelligence files the way other officers read entertainment thoroughly. And late into the night, he had a data tablet in his hand. His face was doing something complicated. Commander, Veth said, stopping beside Shalkathan. He kept his voice low. I have been pulling records on the human military since the ship appeared. I think you should hear what I found. Shalkathan looked at him. Make it brief. Veth looked down at his tablet. Then he looked up. You know the Drakari hegemony? The name was familiar. Every senior Vorkai officer knew it, the way you know the name of something that had existed long ago and was now gone. The Drakari had been one of the oldest civilizations in this region of the galaxy. A slave empire, enormous and ancient, that had been absorbing species for thousands of years. They had been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful forces in known space. They no longer existed. They were destroyed, Shalkathan said. Internal collapse. Rebellion. Partially correct, Veth said. There was a rebellion. The humans started it. He held up the tablet. 200 years ago, humanity made first contact with the Drakari. The Drakari attempted to enslave them. Within 40 years, the humans had not only broken free, but had begun a systematic campaign to dismantle the entire hegemony. It took 160 years. The war had a name. They called it the Long Reckoning. The bridge was very quiet. The Ares Unbound, Veth continued, is a war titan. That is the human classification. They built 17 of them during the Long Reckoning. They were not built to fight other ships. They were built to fight the Drakari's own capital weapons, planet cracker platforms, mobile fortresses, deep space siege engines, things that no normal warship could touch. He paused. The Drakari built those weapons over thousands of years. The humans matched them in less than a century. Nobody on the bridge said anything. Shalkathan looked at the screen. The Ares Unbound had not moved. It was simply sitting there, enormous and patient, with 43 seconds left on the clock that Admiral Osei had given him. "How many War Titans do they currently have?" he asked. Veth was quiet for a moment. "The records are not fully current, Commander, but based on what is available, 12 active, 3 in reserve status, 2 in refit." He stopped. "The Ares Unbound was listed as reserve, sir. It was parked here, dormant. The colony's beacon activated it." Shalkathan turned and looked at Veth directly. He needed to be sure he had understood that correctly. "This was the reserve asset." "Yes, Commander. They sent the reserve. They did not send it," Veth said carefully. "It was already here. It was the closest available vessel." The silence that followed that sentence was the heaviest silence Shalkathan had ever experienced on a bridge in 30 years of service. Closest available. Not their best option. Not a dedicated response. The nearest thing they had, which had been parked near a farming colony, dormant. The way you store a tool you do not currently need, but want nearby, in case something comes up. The humans had a farming world in the outer rim, and they had parked a continent-sized war machine near it as a precaution, the way a farmer keeps a loaded weapon by the door, not because they expect trouble, but because the universe is large, and sometimes trouble comes anyway. He thought about the other 12, active, presumably positioned at other human colonies, other farming worlds, other quiet places in the outer rim where people grew food and raised children and went about their lives under the distant, patient shadow of things, built to destroy anything that came too close. His hands were trembling. He noticed it the way you notice a small thing in a moment of very large things distantly, with a part of the mind that is still working normally while the rest has stopped. He looked at the screen again, at the gun batteries, at the hull that his sensors could not penetrate, at the drive, plumes burning white and calm, at the tallies, 41 seconds. "There is something else," Veth said. His voice had dropped further. He was reading from the tablet. "After the long reckoning, most species expected humanity to expand aggressively. They had the military power. They had the momentum. Nobody could have stopped them." He turned the tablet over in his hands. "They did not expand. They went home. They passed what they call the Colonial Defense Directives, a set of laws governing when and how their military is permitted to act. Defensive posture only, outside of specific circumstances. Meaning they do not attack," Shalkathan said. "Meaning they wait to be attacked," Veth said. "And then they respond." He looked up from the tablet and at the main screen, at the Ares Unbound. "We attacked, Commander. We came here, to their space, to their colony, and we began an approach. We activated the beacon. We started the clock." Shalkathan said nothing. "The colony administrator warned us," Veth said. "The Admiral gave us 60 seconds. They have followed every protocol correctly. Whatever happens next." "I know what that means," Shalkathan said sharply. He did know. It meant that if he did not respond, the Ares Unbound would act with full legal authority under human law. It meant that there would be no diplomatic problem for the humans afterward. No one to complain to. No argument to make. The Vorkai had entered human space, ignored a direct warning from the colony, and ignored the fleet commander's chance to withdraw. They had done everything wrong. Shalkathan had been in this business long enough to recognize when a situation had turned. He had walked into a room he thought was empty, and found it was full. He had 14 conquests, yes, but he had survived 14 campaigns, partly because he knew when to push forward and when to stop. He opened his mouth to order the communications officer to respond to Admiral Osei, to begin a withdrawal. To save his fleet, the only way it could still be saved. 22 seconds. 30 of his senior officers were watching him. 30 officers who had followed him across 14 worlds. He thought about the shame of it, about what it would mean to the fleet, about what Vorkai Command would say when he came home and reported that he had backed down from a single ship. 20 seconds. Then he thought about the tallies on the hull. He thought about what had earned every one of them. He looked at his communications officer. He opened his mouth. The 60 seconds ended. The Ares Unbound spoke again. The Admiral's voice was exactly the same as before. Unhurried, calm, completely without anger or excitement. She said 3 sentences. Firing solution locked. Authorizing response under Colonial Defense Directive 1. A short pause. For the record, they warned you. On the main screen, the gun batteries of the Ares Unbound began, slowly and deliberately, to move. Shalkathan gave the order to fire. He gave it because he had run out of time, and his mouth had made a choice before his mind could stop it. He gave it because 30 officers were watching him, and the silence had become unbearable. He gave it because some old, deep part of him, the part that had built 14 victories out of nerve and instinct, refused to believe that one ship, no matter how large, could hold against 200. He would remember giving that order for the rest of his life. Every warship in the Vorkai fleet opened fire at the same moment. 200 vessels, thousands of weapon systems. The space between the fleet and the Ares Unbound became a solid wall of energy beam. Weapons, kinetic rounds, explosive projectiles, everything they had, all of it converging on a single target. It was, by any calculation, enough firepower to crack a small moon, enough to strip the surface off a planet, enough to simply erase most things that existed in space. It hit the Ares Unbound like rain hits a mountain. The shields absorbed the first wave without any visible strain. The energy weapons diffused across a barrier that didn't even flicker. The kinetic rounds slowed and stopped, as if they had hit deep water. The explosives detonated against the outer field, and produced light and heat that the War Titan's sensors noted with the same interest a person shows when a moth bumps against a window. The barrage went on for 8 full seconds, the entire fleet pouring everything it had into a single continuous strike, and when it ended, the Ares Unbound looked exactly as it had before. Not a mark on the shields, not a flicker in the drive plumes. The gun batteries were still moving, slow and deliberate, finding their angles. Then the Ares Unbound fired back. It did not fire everything. That was the first thing Shalkathan understood. In the horrible clarity of those first few seconds, it chose specific targets. The shots were precise, controlled bursts of energy that moved faster than his targeting systems could fully track, curved around the geometry of the fleet formation, and struck exactly where they were aimed. The first wave hit the drive sections of the 12 nearest Vorkai warships. Not the hulls, not the weapons, the drives. All 12 vessels went dark simultaneously, coasting, still intact, still pressurized. Their crews alive and unhurt, but completely unable to move. The second wave, 3 seconds later, took the weapons arrays off another 20 ships. Again, targeted. Again, precise. The crews were not killed. The ships were not destroyed. They were simply removed from the fight, stripped of the tools that made them dangerous. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Shalkathan understood this quickly, and the understanding was worse than any wound. The Ares Unbound was not trying to destroy his fleet. It was taking it apart, piece by piece, the way a technician dismantles a machine methodically, without anger, with complete confidence that the machine has no capacity to resist. It was showing the Vorkai fleet exactly how outmatched they were, and it was doing so with the minimum force necessary, because more was not necessary. That restraint was the most frightening thing Shalkathan had ever seen in combat. He ordered evasive maneuvers. The fleet spread, broke formation, tried to create a more complex target profile. The Ares Unbound moved to compensate. And here was the second great horror. For its size, it moved wrong. A vessel that large should have been slow. It should have been rigid, committed to each heading for long seconds, before it could change direction. Instead, it moved the way a predator moves, not fast in the simple sense, but perfectly responsive, perfectly precise, as if the distance between where it was and where it needed to be was merely a detail to be resolved. One of Shalkathan's officers shouted that it was impossible. Ships that big did not maneuver like that. Physics did not allow it. The Ares Unbound continued to move, apparently unconcerned with what physics allowed. The battle, if it could be called, that lasted 40 minutes. In that time, The War Titan disabled 180 Vorkai warships. Not one of them was destroyed. Not one crew member, as far as Shalkathan could determine, had been killed. Each ship had been precisely disarmed, or immobilized, or both, and then left to drift. The remaining 20 ships of the fleet, including the dominant Will, had pulled back as far as they could go, which was not far, because the Ares Unbound had also, at some point in the last 20 minutes, disabled their FTL drives. Quietly, without announcement. They had simply tried to calculate a jump, and found that the calculations would not complete, and then Pelsev had run a systems check, and found that their FTL capacitors had been struck and drained by some weapon so precise that it had passed through their shields as if they were not there and touched only the specific system it was aimed at. They were caught, held in place, in their own fleet formation, by a vessel that had not yet shown them anything close to its full capability. At one of the lower gun stations, a young Vorkai gunner named Desh sat very still at his post. He was 23 years old. He had joined the fleet because it was a secure career with good pay and reasonable danger, or so he had thought. He had grown up hearing about the Vorkai conquests, the strength of the fleet, the certainty of their dominance. He had believed it, the way young people believe things that the older world tells them about itself. He was not crying exactly. His eyes were wet. His hands were pressed flat on his console so that nobody would see them shaking. He was watching the Ares Unbound on his small secondary screen and thinking, with terrible clarity, a single thought, that he had sailed to this system with 200 ships and absolute confidence, and that on the other side of that metal hull, behind those guns, and that armor, and those drive plumes, there were humans, just humans, the young species, the soft species, the farmers sitting at their own consoles, doing their jobs. And they were not afraid. They had not been afraid at any point. Not when the fleet arrived. Not when the shooting started. Not during 40 minutes of combat. Because they had built this thing. They had climbed inside it, and they knew what it could do, and they knew what it had done before, and the tallies on the hull meant something to them that was different from what the tallies meant to him. To him, the tallies were a warning. To them, the tallies were a history. A record of every time something had come at them, and found out what they were. He put his face in his hands. On the bridge, Shalkathan's communications board opened. Admiral Osei's voice came through again. Still calm. Still unhurried. Fleet Commander, your fleet has been immobilized. Your weapons have been disabled. You are not in danger, and your crews are not in danger. I want to be clear about that. No one will be harmed. A pause. But you are not leaving this system until we have had a conversation. I suggest you open a channel. Shalkathan looked at the screen. At the 20 ships he still had, drifting, weapons dark, unable to run. At the 180 others scattered across the orbital space, like leaves after wind. At the Ares Unbound, holding position between all of them and the planet, its drives burning white and patient. He had 14 conquests. He had never surrendered, not once, not to anyone. He reached out and opened the channel. When he spoke, his voice came out steady. He was proud of that too. Even here, even now, his voice came out steady. Admiral Osei, he said, this is Fleet Commander Shalkathan of the Vorkai Imperial Fleet. He breathed in. He breathed out. We surrender. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then the Admiral said simply, I'll be in touch, and closed the line. The fields of Karoth, 7 were green in the morning light. Director Yeva Marchetti stood at the wide observation window of the Colonial Administration Building, on the top floor, holding a mug of coffee in both hands. The mug was warm. The coffee was good locally grown, which she always thought was one of the underrated benefits of running an agricultural colony. Outside, the sky was the pale blue of early morning, and the hills beyond the town were beginning to catch the first long light of the system's star. Birds were calling somewhere below the window. A supply drone hummed past on its morning run. It looked like any other morning. It felt like any other morning. Above the sky, invisible from the ground but visible on the building's tracking displays, 200 disabled Vorkai warships sat in a loose formation in low orbit. surrounded by 8 colonial defense escort vessels that had arrived 4 hours after the battle ended. The escorts were small by comparison to the Ares unbound quick, maneuverable patrol craft, the kind the colony's own small defense force operated. They were circling the captured fleet with calm efficiency, beginning the long process of safe containment and documentation. The Ares unbound itself had not left. It sat further out, beyond the orbital band, not needed for the escort operation but present anyway. Watching. The way old things watch without obvious attention, but without ever really looking away. A small hand tugged at Marchetti's sleeve. She looked down. One of the town engineer's daughters had come in with her mother for the morning shift and had wandered up to the observation floor, as children in small colonial administrations sometimes did. She was maybe 8 years old. She had dark, serious eyes, and her hair was in 2 uneven braids that suggested she had done them herself. She was looking out the window at the sky. Then she looked at the tracking display on the wall, which showed the positions of all vessels in the orbital space as small icons. The Ares Unbound showed as a large, solid shape, much larger than any of the other icons. The child studied it with the particular focus that children bring to things they do not yet understand, but have decided to figure out. "What is that big one?" she asked. Marchetti looked at the display. She drank some coffee. "That," she said, "is an old promise we made to ourselves." The girl looked at her, clearly wanting more than that. Marchetti thought about how to explain it. She thought about the long reckoning, and the Drakari, and the 160 years of war that had produced the War Titans. She thought about the generation of humans who had built those ships, not in comfort or safety, but under occupation, under threat, in secret, and in desperation, and in fury, and who had built them not just to win a single battle, but to make sure that no one would ever look at humanity again and see only something easy to take. She thought about the choice that had been made afterward, to put those ships in reserve rather than use them to conquer, and what that choice said about the people who had made it. She was not sure all of that was right for an 8-year-old before breakfast. "It keeps bad people from hurting us," she said instead. The girl considered this seriously. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to look for her mother. Marchetti turned back to the window and her coffee. Outside, the morning went on being a morning. Aboard the Dominant Will, in the quiet of the officers' quarters, Sub-Commander Veth sat at his small desk with his data tablet. He had not slept. He was not sure he would sleep for some time. The ship was still, drifting in its captured position, the lights at half power to conserve energy from the damaged systems. The rest of the bridge crew had been stood down. Some of them were sleeping. Some were talking quietly in the mess. Commander Shalcathan was in his own quarters with the door closed, and nobody had knocked on it. Veth was reading. He had continued his intelligence file on humanity after the battle ended, because he needed to understand, and because understanding was the only thing he had left to do that felt useful. He had read about the Long Reckoning in more detail. He had read about the colonies, and the trade networks, and the political structure. He had read about the colonial defense directives, and what they meant in practice. Now he was reading the section on military assets. He read the full list of war titans, their names, their classifications, their current statuses. 12 active, 3 reserve, 2 refit. He had known these numbers. Veth had told Shalcathan these numbers on the bridge. But reading them again, now, after 40 minutes of watching the Ares Unbound dismantle 200 warships, with the calm focus of someone completing a routine task, the numbers meant something different. 12 active war titans. 12. Parked near human colonies across the outer rim like guard dogs, dormant, waiting. Each one of them equivalent to what he had just watched. Each one of them carrying the history of the Long Reckoning in the scars on its hull and the tallies beside its name. And those were only the assets that were publicly documented. Veth closed the file. He set the tablet face down on the desk. He stared at the wall of the ship for a long time. Admiral Dioniose's call to Shalcathan came 6 hours after the surrender. She was on the main screen in his quarters, sitting in what looked like a small briefing room aboard the Ares Unbound. She was a compact woman, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had done a lot of thinking over a lot of years, and had settled into something permanently level. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked the way a person looks when they are finishing up a piece of work and thinking about the next one. She told him how it would go. The damaged ships would be assessed. The crews were not prisoners, they would be housed in their own vessels, with power and life support fully restored, and they would be given food from colonial stores. No one would be mistreated. When the formal documentation was complete, and the diplomatic channels between the Vorkai and human governments had been opened, which she expected would happen, within a few weeks, the fleet would be escorted to the border, and Keys released. Shalkathan would go home. Most of his people would go home. Whole. Alive. I want you to understand something, Admiral Osei said. She spoke plainly, without cruelty. We did not want this. We have never wanted war. We have not launched an offensive military action in 90 years. The colonial defense directives are not a technicality, they reflect something we genuinely believe, which is that the galaxy works better when species are left alone to make their own choices. She looked at him steadily through the screen. But we will always respond to a threat to our people. Every time. Without exception. That is not a policy. It is a fact about what we are. Shalkathan nodded. He had nothing useful to say. Go home, she said. Tell your government what happened here. Tell them exactly what you saw. Show them the battle records if you need to. Make sure that whoever needs to understand this, understands it. 1. She reached forward to close the channel, then paused. 14 conquests, she said. He blinked, she had clearly done her own reading. You are good at what you do, Commander. Be good at something else. She held his eyes for a moment. The galaxy has enough of this already. The screen went dark. Shalkathan sat in his quiet quarters for a very long time. Across the galaxy, in the weeks and months that followed, certain things happened quietly. Species that had been watching the situation from a careful distance updated their assessments of humanity. Not dramatically. There was no panic. No sudden realignment of political relationships. Just a series of small recalculations made by analysts and commanders and government advisors who were very good at reading situations. A footnote became a heading. A curiosity became a category. A species that had been filed under young, expanding, monitor was moved to a different file with a different kind of notation beside it, because the Ares Unbound had not been a secret. The War Titans were not hidden. Anyone who looked could find the public records. But there is a difference between knowing something exists and watching it work. There is a distance between reading about a thing and seeing it hold still, while 200 warships pour everything they have at it, and then, calmly, take those 200 warships apart without destroying a single one. The Vorkai fleet had done everyone a favor, in their way. They had provided a demonstration. They had answered, with real data, the question that many species had quietly held. Yes, but what would actually happen? Now they knew, and in the knowledge, there was a kind of stillness. Not peace, the galaxy was not so simple as that, but a recalibration, a new line drawn in people's understanding of where the limits were and what lived on the other side of them. The Ares Unbound returned to the shadow of Karath, Seven's moon, 4 days after the captured fleet departed for the border. It moved slowly, the way it always moved, massive and deliberate, filling the space it occupied the way mountains fill landscapes. Its drive plumes cooled gradually as it settled back into its resting position against the dark stone of the lunar surface. Its lights dimmed from operational to standby, one section at a time, until only the running lights remained, small and steady in the dark. It went back to sleep, patient, the way old things are patient, the way things are patient when they have already been through the worst the universe had to offer, when they have the scars to prove it, and when they know with the deep, settled certainty of lived experience that whatever comes next, they have been through worse before, and they are still here. On Karath 7, the morning continued. The fields stayed green. The birds kept calling. The supply drone finished its run and went back to its dock. An 8-year-old girl with uneven braids ate breakfast and went to school and did not think about War Titans for the rest of the day, because she was 8 and there were more interesting things to think about. and because the world she lived in was safe, and she had always known it was safe, and she did not know the name of the old thing resting in the dark above her that made it so. She did not need to. It remembered for her.